So, welcome everybody. I'll just turn my camera on for a minute so that you can see me. I'll just say hello. So, hello everybody. My name is Professor Louise Ryan and I'm a senior professor here at London Metropolitan University. I'm also director of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, which is a relatively new centre. We set it up in June 2020. And the session today on research ethics in the field is a kind of co-production brought to you today by the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, working with the Postgraduate Research Training Unit. So we are doubling up to provide this training session for postgraduate students, but also in collaboration with the Research Centre. And if any of you are interested in finding out more about the Research Centre, I can post a link to the Centre webpage in the chat, and then you can see a little bit more about what we do. We've got a very good seminar series, and they're free online seminars, and anybody is welcome to come. So without further ado, let me do that now so I don't forget, and then I can officially start the session. So I'm sharing my screen, so I hope you can all see the PowerPoint that I've just opened. But first, let me just share. So this is the direct link that will take you to the Research Centre. Oh, thank you, Anna has already shared it. So you've got a double dose now of links to the centre. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody can see the PowerPoint. Can somebody just let me know, please, that you can see the PowerPoint I'm sharing? Yes, thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll turn off my camera to save the bandwidth. Right, so we'll start. So the purpose of today is that I'm going to begin with a lecture, really, a kind of an opportunity to raise some issues and some thoughts, engage with the relevant literature, and also to share some experiences from my own career of doing research, social science research, and to present some of the dilemmas that I've experienced in the field from a couple of different projects. And then after that, I'll pause and there'll be an opportunity for questions. So please, at that point, go ahead. If you have questions, you can ask me questions. And then after that, I'm going to turn off the recorder. So please, somebody remind me to turn off the recorder. And at that point, I will then be inviting you to raise your hand and share some of your ethical dilemmas in the field. You can stay anonymous if you wish, or you can raise kind of general experiences. I don't want anybody to share something that is too personal. Or you can type it in the chat, but it might be easier if you raise your hand, and then I'll ask people to turn their mics on and talk. So the first part of today is going to be largely me talking, but then I am going to turn off the recorder and then I'm going to invite you to speak. So perhaps while I'm speaking now, over the next 35 minutes or so, it would be useful if you could start to think about maybe some of your experiences of either having done research or being about to do research, and some of the dilemmas that you're considering in relation to social science research ethics. So maybe have a piece of paper and pen and just jot down some ideas as we go along. But I hope as well you'll also be listening to the content of today's PowerPoint. And if anybody wants to receive a copy of the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to share that as well. Okay, so let's get started. Now, of course, as you know, all research, including PhD research, requires prior ethical approval. I'm sure all of you who are PhD students, or all of you who have done research at various points, will have had to get ethical approval from your university. The issue that I want to address today is not about the process of getting ethical approval, but it's rather about something which is much deeper than that. It's about the ethics of the kinds of research that we do. And it's about trying to be honest about the real ethical challenges that we encounter when we get out there in the research field. And when you're filling out your ethics form, which you tend to do right at the beginning of your research, it is not always easy to anticipate in advance what ethical challenges you may meet a year down the road, 2 years down the road. So that's kind of the process that I want to talk about today. In addition to that, I also want to suggest that rather than simply adhering to hard and fast ethical guidelines, the ethical dilemmas in the field may involve addressing tricky, unanticipated situations on a case-by-case basis. It's not a situation where you can go and sort of look up the ethics guidelines of your university and come to the answer. Oh yes, according to the guidelines, this is what I need to do in this very tricky situation that I've just encountered in the field. The tricky situation you encounter in the field may not be anticipated in the ethics guidelines from your university. So instead, what I'm saying is we need to train ourselves, or to be trained, to become ethical researchers, researchers who, kind of regardless of the ethical challenges that we meet, will have the necessary skills, know-how, empathy, judgment, reflexivity to be able to address those issues as they occur in the field. So I really want to emphasize the importance of reflexivity today. So the session will be discussing adopting a reflexive approach and how that can enhance our skills as ethical researchers. And all of you will have done a lot of training in research methods, how to design a questionnaire, how to design a focus group topic guide, how to design an interview schedule. You will have done all of the kind of know-how methods training, but this is about kind of how to be reflexive, how to bring an ethical lens to every aspect of your research. So it may be different from some of the other kinds of research training that you've had in the past. Okay, so let's move on. So what I want to talk about today is becoming an ethical researcher. Now, over the past decade or so, research governance has led to a huge bureaucracy of documentation, procedures, and administrative hierarchies, particularly within universities in relation to what we can see as ethical governance, or the governance of research ethics, the administrative procedure around research ethics. But it has been suggested that in some cases, the risk is that this then leads to a sort of tick box approach to research ethics. So, oh, I have to fill in my ethics form. I have to tick all the boxes. Have you done this? Have you done that? Have you checked this? Have you checked that? Tick, tick, tick. That's the approach to ethics. And if that is our approach to ethics, then clearly there's something wrong somewhere, because that is absolutely not how we should be approaching ethics. So there's a risk that this kind of very bureaucratic, very formulaic, form-filling approach to ethics can reduce real-life ethical dilemmas to a narrow series of questions about access, consent, and anonymity. I'm not going to be saying too much about access, consent, and anonymity today, because that gets discussed everywhere. I want to discuss some of the kind of more tricky issues that often lie outside of the box. So in a very nice article from 2014, Guillemin and Gillam, it's a bit of a tongue twister to say those two names, distinguish between what they call procedural ethics, by which they mean the bureaucracy of ethics governance, and what they call ethics in practice, the actual ethical dilemmas that we encounter when we are out there doing research. So this is a very important differentiation between procedural ethics and ethics in practice. And I'm going to be talking quite a lot about that today. And they go on to say on page 269 of their 2004 article, it is within the dimension of ethics in practice that the researcher's ethical competence comes to the fore. By this we mean the researcher's willingness to acknowledge the ethical dimension of research practice, his or her ability to actually recognize this ethical dimension when it comes into play, and his or her ability to think through ethical issues and respond appropriately. Now, there's a lot in that quote. That's a really rich quote. So I'd just like to take a moment to kind of pull out some of the most salient points there. So they're talking there about the researcher's willingness to acknowledge the ethical dimensions of research practice. And that requires that we need to be open-minded. We need to be reflexive. We need to ask ourselves, what are the ethical issues here? So it's the first thing they talk about there is this willingness to acknowledge the ethical issues. The second thing is our ability to actually recognize these dimensions when they come into play. So we recognize an ethical dilemma when it occurs. And sometimes they're not obvious. Sometimes these ethical dilemmas can be quite subtle. And we may not even realize, oh, actually, there's ethical implications to what's happening right now. And finally, our ability to think through these ethical issues and respond appropriately. So in other words, as I said earlier, when things occur in the field that we're not expecting, that we recognize them to have an ethical dimension, and we think through very carefully what's the appropriate way to respond. So this is actually quite hard. This might sound like, oh, this is what you need to do, here's the answer. But actually, it's not always the case that there's a straightforward answer. So it's more about developing your skills to try to find strategies for addressing what can often be tricky, unanticipated problems in the field. And the way that I've done that over the years is really by trying to develop this reflexivity. So instead of seeing ethics as straightforward, taken for granted, and universal, researchers need to be trained in understanding the complexities and the messiness of ethics. So you may not have expected that today we would be talking about the messiness of ethics, but ethics are very messy. They are not always universal. You could say, well, there are certain universal, taken for granted givens. You shouldn't harm somebody. You shouldn't lie to somebody. You shouldn't hurt somebody. But actually, most research, the ethical issues are far more subtle than that. The issues are more blurred. They're not so straightforward. And the ethical issues you may encounter are much messier than that. So these are some of the examples I want to pull out and discuss with you this afternoon. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to try to develop our skills and understanding so that we become ethical researchers, so that when we do research, we bring this ethical awareness with us. And we have this kind of ethical compass almost that we develop and we learn. And that is associated with this reflexive way of thinking. So a key part of becoming an ethical researcher is to develop a reflexive way of thinking about the messy reality of ethics in the field. Reflexivity as a process of ethical self-examination allows the researcher not only to locate themselves as active participants in the research process, but also to explore in an open and honest way the impact of the research, both the positive and the negative, on all those involved, including the researcher themselves. So this is about locating yourself as a researcher in the research process. So when I'm talking about ethics, when I'm writing about ethics, I always do it in the first person, because you have to own this. You have to take responsibility for this. It is you as a researcher who is doing this work. And it is you as a researcher who needs to think about, what part am I playing in this process? What is my role in this research encounter? And that requires you to be very reflexive and to dig deep and to really think about who you are in that encounter, how you relate to the participants and how the participants relate to you, how they perceive you, and what responsibilities do you have. So it really requires a much broader, a much broader understanding of the research process. So it's not about you going out into the field with your questionnaire or your interview and asking somebody questions and that's it. It's a straightforward process. You questions, they give the answers. The end. It's about having a much more sensitive and empathetic understanding of all of the complex dynamics around that process, so that you can begin to think about the ethical issues that are at play in all of our encounters, but particularly in research encounters. So reflexivity involves honesty and openness about how, where, and by whom the data were collected, and locates the researcher as a participant in the dynamic interrelationship of the research process. Now, that honesty and openness actually is easier said than done. It is sometimes quite hard to be really honest about what's going on in the research encounter. But it's worth the effort, because reflexivity helps the researcher to pause and to consider what is going on, to think about how to respond, to react in an appropriate way, and to learn lessons about how in the future such situations might be dealt with differently. Because no matter what goes wrong, there's always an opportunity for learning. It's always an opportunity to reflect and think, well, did that go as well as I expected? Was there something there that I hadn't really prepared for, or I hadn't respected? What lessons have I learned, and how could I do that better the next time? So being honest about your mistakes is a way of getting better. It's a way of doing it better the next time. So this matters because, as D'Souza has noted, reflexivity can enhance the credibility and rigor of the research process, as well as make transparent the positionality of the researcher. And that goes back to what I said at the start of that slide there, being honest about how, where, and by whom the data were collected. So who is the researcher? What is the positionality of the researcher? And how does that relate to the research participants? And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So reflexivity has been linked to good research ethics. As Kleinsasser has observed, reflexivity enables the researcher to explore ethical entanglements before, during, and after the research. And I really like that phrase, ethical entanglements, because if you think about something that is entangled, it's all knotted up. If you think about a piece of string or something that's become entangled, it's really knotted. All the bits are all mixed up together. And that's what the kind of ethical issues are. They're often entangled with a whole load of other issues in the research process. And the other thing I like about that quote from Kleinsasser is they talk about these entanglements, trying to think about them and explore them before you go in to do the research, during the process of doing the research, but afterwards as well, when you reflect back on what has taken place. But being reflexive is not necessarily a comfortable experience, because it requires quite a high level of self-examination, that you really ask yourself some tricky questions. It forces us to confront challenges and difficulties in research in an open and honest way, admitting where maybe we've made mistakes or we haven't done things as well as we could have done. So rather than simply presenting your findings, I'm sure we've all watched those cookery programs where they say that famous phrase, "and here's one I made earlier." There's often a sense of you're now presenting your findings magically, as if here they are, I made them earlier. You don't need to know about all that messy process that went on in the background. You just need to see my lovely polished findings. But of course, what I'm saying is it is precisely those messy processes that go on in the background that we really need to scrutinize, because that's where those ethical dilemmas get played out. And if you kind of conceal those messy ethical entanglements, then there's no opportunity to learn lessons from them. So when we present our findings, it behoves us to also acknowledge the kind of ethical issues that we encountered in collecting the data and in analysing and writing up the data, and how we sought to overcome them and what lessons we've learned in the process. As Pillow reminds us, reflexivity demands an ongoing critique of all our research attempts, and recognition that none of our attempts can claim the innocence of success. So reflexivity is an ongoing process. It never ends. You can never say, well, that's it now, I've done that. Tick that box, that's finished. It's always ongoing, and that's why we should never kind of claim that we've succeeded, because we can always learn more and we can always reflect more. As I've said, such honest reflexivity isn't necessarily easy, and it cannot be assumed that all researchers have sufficient self-awareness, sensitivity, or empathy to acknowledge such a situation. So that's why training is so important, because we can't just assume that somebody will pick up on what may be quite subtle sensitivities in the research process. We can't assume that they will be obvious to everybody, especially relatively inexperienced researchers. And that's why it is important that we talk about these messy ethical issues, so that we can try to develop the sensitivity and the self-awareness and empathy. These are skills that can be developed and honed with time and with practice. Therefore, developing such critical reflexivity needs to become part of research training programs. As I've said, these are skills that can be taught and developed over time. And I have observed that while reflexivity is often included in qualitative research methods training, it is still less prevalent in quantitative research methods training. Perhaps it's assumed that you don't need this kind of level of reflexivity when you're doing quantitative research, because you're dealing with numbers and it's all very straightforward. But that's not true, because of course all of this data are produced in particular ways, and we do need to be reflexive, including when we're doing quantitative research, and not just assume that it doesn't apply in that case. And I have done research, quantitative research, as well as qualitative research, and I absolutely know that you need to be very reflexive in quantitative research as well. Okay, so let's talk more now about the positionality, because I spoke earlier about being honest about the positionality of the researcher. And so what do we mean by that? When we talk about positionality, what are we talking about there? And I hope that many of you will have read the article that I recommended for today, which is an article that I wrote in 2015 on positionality and reflexivity. So much has been written about so-called insiders and outsiders in the research process. And I am very critical of those notions. If anybody ever says to me, oh, I'm an insider or I'm an outsider, I immediately want to say, well, what do you actually mean by that? How are you defining inside? How are you defining outside? Inside of what? Outside of what? Now, often people kind of go around with quite fixed categories based, for example, on ethnicity or on age or gender or class. But of course, none of these operate in isolation. We need to apply an intersectional lens to understand how ethnicity intersects with gender and age and class and all sorts of other characteristics to create complex but also dynamic identities. Those identities are not fixed, they change, and in different situations, particular facets of your identity may come in or out of focus. Sometimes the fact that you're female becomes the most important thing about your identity. For example, if you were doing research with men. Other times, the fact that you're black might become the most salient part of your identity if, for example, you're doing research largely with white people. But at other times, it might be your age. If you're very young and you're doing research with young people, then maybe your youth is the thing that you have most in common with them, and that seems to be very salient. However, all those other parts of your identity have not gone away. They're all there. They're complex ingredients in an active intersection of identities. And I've cited some work there from Heidi Mirza, whom I used to work with many years ago in Middlesex University. Heidi Mirza has published quite a lot about these issues, and also by Anne Phoenix and Elaine Barber, who observe that applying an intersectional lens draws attention to the importance of treating categories and identities in non-essentialist ways. In other words, rather than seeing these identities as somehow fixed, we see them as dynamic and complex and continually interacting and changing in different social settings. So that's why when people talk about insiders and outsiders, I think they're operating often with kind of simplistic assumptions about essentialized identities. But actually, as we've seen there in that quote from Anne Phoenix and Elaine Barber, it's very important that we interrogate what we mean by these identities and appreciate the complex mix of ingredients and experiences that underpin our intersectional identities. And I'm going to come back to that as we go along. And I'd like all of you as well to be thinking about your own complex intersectional identities. What are the various facets of your identities that you think might be most important when you go out to do your research? Now, in my own research and writing, I've used this metaphor of dance to reflect upon the intricate rhythms of shifting positionalities through the interview encounter. And a former PhD of mine, Xia Lin, also very much used this metaphor of dance in her own research. And so by a dance, if you think about two people dancing, then there's a lot of movement there, and there's a lot of shifting positions. One partner moves, the other partner moves. They're shifting positions in relation to each other. And this is the same in an interview encounter, where you're asking questions, the person is responding, but they're also kind of making judgments about you. You're making assumptions about them. They may be asking you some questions, or in their own mind, they may be trying to figure you out. So there's an interplay. There's a rhythmic interaction going on there. And positionality is very much part of that, because particular aspects of our identity are being perceived by the participants, and perhaps they're being perceived differently to how we perceive them. So you might think, oh, I'm going to do research with somebody, I've got loads in common with them, and they may look at you and think, well, who's this person from the university? I've got nothing in common with you. So the way in which we project our identity and the way in which our identity is perceived may be very different in a research encounter. And so this kind of shifting dance is important, because like a dance, it keeps moving. And so sometimes in an interview, or if you're administering a questionnaire, or you're facilitating a focus group, or any other kind of research that you're engaged in, some participant observation, ethnography, whatever it might be, when you're doing that research, a particular thing that you say, a particular way that you react may change the relationship with the participant. It may change how they perceive you. If they say something and you laugh, then they might think, oh, actually, this guy's cool, because they get this sense of humor. They laughed in the appropriate time. Or if at another point you make a comment, then that might suggest to them, actually, this guy hasn't got a clue about our lives. He's just asked this really stupid question. So this is an ongoing dynamic. And that's why I think it's important to emphasize this, because sometimes when you go to meet somebody for research, or you go to do a focus group, there may be a bit of tension. You may think, oh dear, this is going to be tricky. They're not warming up to me. There's no rapport. This is not going as well as I'd hoped for. But don't give up, because it is a dance. And like a dance, the positions can change. And if you work hard at it and you use all of your empathy, all of your sensitivity, all of your powers of observation to read the body language and really pay close attention, it is possible to shift that dynamic. And it's possible to change the rapport and build rapport as the research encounter goes along. Now, of course, all of this is underpinned by power differentials. And those power dynamics can play out in different ways. Sometimes you as the researcher are the person in a position of power, because you're going there, you're asking the questions, you're extracting the data, and then you're going back to the university and you're going to get your PhD, or you're going to publish a paper, or you're going to write a book. You're going to get something out of this research. Very often, of course, our participants get nothing out of the research at all. So the power dynamic there can feel very unequal. But of course, on other occasions, you might be interviewing people who have far more power than you. You may be doing research with people in a very senior position in an organization. or with people who have political influence. So you may be researching people who are more powerful than you, and you can feel that disadvantage in terms of the power dynamic. So it's important to kind of, again, be very sensitive to those shifting power relationships in a research encounter. Okay, so I am now, having sort of presented all of those big issues, I'm now going to move on to present some of my own experiences. Now, I said earlier that you had to be really honest, and you had to be very reflexive, and you had to openly admit, you know, when things didn't go as well as you had hoped. So I'm now going to be very honest, and I'm going to share some of my experiences with you all, so that you can see, you know, research can be tricky. And as I said back at the beginning, it is not always easy to anticipate these tricky ethical issues at the beginning when you're filling in your ethics form. And so you need to kind of prepare yourself for what may actually happen when you get out there to do the research. So I'm just going to present two short examples, and then later on I would like to hear some of your examples, so maybe you can be thinking about some of your experiences. So first, I want to say a little bit about a research project where I was using network visualization. So visualization is a technique where we draw and physically depict social networks of relationships. And the technique that I use is quite old school. It's paper and pencil. How old school can you get? An actual pencil. And this technique, it doesn't sound very sophisticated, but trust me, it is actually very sophisticated. The process is simple, but the technique is quite sophisticated. So what I do is I get people to talk about their social relationships, their social networks, but also to map their social networks. And I'll show you a picture of one of those in a minute. And so the interview and the sociogram, it's called a sociogram, this representation of a social network, are embedded in an in-depth qualitative interview where I ask the person questions, we talk about their networks, then they draw their networks, then we ask more questions. So this sociogram uses concentric circles, and it's drawn around an ego focal point, which is the person I'm interviewing. And then I collect data on their degrees of closeness across different domains of relationality. So basically I'm trying to map relationality. So I'm including family, friends, neighbors, hobbies, work colleagues, schoolmates, university classmates, etc. So it's as I said, it's based on concentric circles of relationality. I'll just very quickly show you an example. So this is an example of what one looks like, and I'll come back and say a bit more about that in a minute. So let's carry on. So the first example is Cynthia. So Cynthia is a young woman from London, and I interviewed her as part of a project on apprenticeships. So she was engaged in an apprenticeship in a training program in London. Obviously, Cynthia is not her real name. She was interviewed between 2016 and 2017 as part of a larger research project on school engagement and transitions to work. As part of the quality, we had a big survey. That was a mixed methods. We also did a big survey as part of that with thousands of respondents. But we also had a qualitative dimension of the project. And as part of that, a sample of young people were interviewed several times to discuss their experiences of education and their professional plans and aspirations. So Cynthia was met on 4 separate occasions, and she participated in 2 in-depth interviews. The second interview involved completing the sociogram as part of the interview process. So Cynthia was a young Black woman. She was aged 16 and 17 respectively at the time of the 2 interviews, which occurred almost exactly 1 year apart. When Cynthia was a child, her mother died. She was estranged from her father. She was reared by her grandmother, and they still lived together. While the grandmother had initially been Cynthia's carer, now their roles had reversed, and it was Cynthia who was actually caring for her grandmother, who had been diagnosed with dementia. So all of that is really significant to the kind of ethical dilemma I'm now going to describe. So Cynthia remarked in the interview that she missed her friends and she felt very lonely without them. Now, as an apprentice, she was working full-time and studying. So the apprenticeship program she was doing meant that she was working in a professional environment Monday to Friday, kind of 9 to 5, but she also was studying the modules and doing the assignments for her apprenticeship. In addition to all of that, she was looking after her grandmother. Now, while the other apprentices on her program had time to socialize at the weekend, she felt that she was, and this is her quote, stuck at home with Gran. However, she didn't say that with any sense of self-pity or resentment. It was merely a statement of fact that she was stuck at home looking after her grandmother while the other apprentices on her course were out at the weekend. And sometimes they invited her to go along with them, but she wasn't able to because she had to look after her grandmother. Now, Cynthia's sociogram revealed and made plainly visible the extent of her isolation. After adding her few close contacts, she said, "That's all I can think of." So this was her sociogram. Now, believe me, this was very, very sparse. Most of the other young people we interviewed had loads and loads of people in their sociogram, loads of friends. Hers is very, very sparse. Now, I asked Cynthia, who are your main sources of support? And she said, without any doubt, her main source of support was my grandmother, definitely all the way. Now, when Cynthia said that in the interview, I actually felt, I actually reacted to that because to me, that was quite a shocking revelation that her main source of support, the person she relied on most, was her grandmother who had dementia. And to me, that really underlined just how isolated Cynthia was, that she was relying on her grandmother and that she didn't really have any other support in place. Nonetheless, Cynthia herself was very keen to make a positive presentation of self. While acknowledging relational problems, she still asserted, "I feel like this is quite a good network. Except my dad, he doesn't really give me a lot of encouragement." And as I mentioned earlier, she was estranged from her father. She didn't have much contact with him. To me, Cynthia seemed isolated and overburdened for a teenage girl of 16, 17 years of age. Moreover, this raised ethical concerns for me, because now by asking her to visualize her network, I had inadvertently asked her to expose just how limited and sparse her support network was. And when I listened back to the recording afterwards, I was really struck by how many times I had kind of encouraged her to seek more professional support for her grandmother. I then started asking her questions that were not on the interview schedule about whether her grandmother was getting any support, whether any carers coming in. I really found myself taking almost a motherly role as somebody who was older than Cynthia. And in fact, by coincidence, my own son was exactly the same age as Cynthia. So I was interviewing a 16-year-old girl and my son was 16. And I was thinking, wow, imagine if he was in this position where he had only a grandmother with dementia to look after him. How would he cope? So I think I got quite empathetic about the whole experience because I sort of then took on this highly sensitized kind of mothering role. I didn't tell Cynthia that, of course, but I was aware of how much it was impacting on my own emotions in that encounter. Now, just to remind you, the aim of this research that I was doing at the time was about the training and employment experiences of young apprentices. So none of the issues that I was now talking about with Cynthia, they were not research questions. This was not what the research was about. And that's what I mean by the unexpected, messy reality of doing research, because I had not expected that I would be talking about these issues with Cynthia. And it was only when she started to describe her private life that these issues came up. So they would never have been anticipated, really, if you were filling out an ethics form, because these are not issues that I wasn't asking her questions like this, but this was the story that she presented to me. And then I had to decide in that moment, how am I going to react to this situation? The second example is quite different in many ways, but it involves the similar research instrument. So this was Colette. And Colette participant in a French study that I did a number of years ago. And again, I was visualizing networks. Now, when I was filling out when I was interviewing Colette and Colette was filling out the sociogram, she populated the image with numerous social ties. I don't have a picture of that now, but if you can remember what, I don't have a picture of it, do I? No, okay, just checking. So if you remember how sparsely populated Cynthia's sociogram was, Colette's was nothing like that. Colette's was packed full of all sorts of people, business colleagues, friends, family. She had a big extended family. Her sociogram was very, very densely populated. So we did that, and she filled in the sociogram and we left it on the table, and then we carried on with the interview. So later in the course of the interview, Colette discussed the appeal of living in London. And she really emphasized how cosmopolitan London was, and she was very attracted to the cosmopolitanism of this global city. She spoke very positively about the diversity of ethnicities, cuisine, language, music, everything that made up London society. As a highly skilled French woman, working in a very senior role in a financial corporation in Canary Wharf, so she was right in the city of London, Colette perceived herself to be living and working in the cosmopolitan heart of a global city. This was a key part of her identity. However, having previously drawn the sociogram, in a way she had already committed to paper, in quite a tangible way, who were her social connections in London. She'd already drawn the picture. However, I then say to her, so in terms of the networks that you've described here, how cosmopolitan would you say your networks are? So she had drawn this picture, we'd put it on the table, then she'd carried on talking about London. Then I draw her attention back to the sociogram and I say, oh, okay, so how cosmopolitan are your networks? And her answer, I think, is really interesting because she starts off very, very, because I have, let me think about it. Actually, because I say I am, but I am not. Now, this was such an incredible quote. It's almost like a sort of a script from a movie, because she starts off very, very. And I guess if we hadn't had the sociogram in front of us on the table, she perhaps would have carried on with very, 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 my networks are so cosmopolitan, very, very cosmopolitan. But it was when she looked at the sociogram that she stopped, absolutely stopped in her tracks and said, let me think about it, actually, because I say I am, but I am not. And because when we looked at the sociogram, in fact, most of the people in her sociogram were French or English, some Spanish, some Italian, but they were really not anything like the kind of cosmopolitan diversity of London that she had a few moments earlier been singing the praises of. Now, this created a very awkward moment in the interview because it almost felt like I had trapped her, that I'd set her up. It was almost like a sort of a case for the prosecution in a courtroom drama, that I just kind of went, ta-da, but here's Exhibit A, your sociogram, and this isn't cosmopolitan at all. What do you have to say for yourself, madam? Obviously, I didn't say any of those things, but it's almost how it felt. It felt very awkward. It felt very embarrassing. She was a lovely woman. She had been so kind. She'd given me so much of her time, and she'd given me a lovely interview. She talked to me for ages. She was so pleasant, and there was great rapport. Everything was lovely. And then this moment happened in the interview, and I felt really bad because I was kind of challenging her representation of herself. And because she had visualized it in the sociogram, she also felt very embarrassed, I think, by the image of herself didn't tally with what was there on paper in front of us. So a really difficult moment, and I felt I had to work very hard after that to kind of rebuild the rapport of the interview. So, as discussed elsewhere, asking a participant to visualize their relationships on paper does definitely carry particular ethical responsibilities over and above just asking the usual kind of interview questions. There's something about this tangible, physical drawing on paper in front of us. It becomes very real. In a way, when somebody talks, it's very fleeting. You can say something and then you can say something different a few minutes later. But when it's actually there on paper, it really confronts you. So the visual image may show social connections in a way that was not expected by the participants. And that's clearly illustrated in the case of Colette, but also in a different way in the case of Cynthia. Therefore, great sensitivity and reflexivity is needed when using this particular kind of research method, and it absolutely behoves researchers to pay attention to how the participant is reacting to the emerging image. And it may be necessary to create additional space for the participant to reflect and talk about their reactions to the visual image as well. Okay, I'm going to conclude now because I'm very keen to get all of you talking. So just some very quick concluding thoughts. I am not claiming, and I can never claim, that I have achieved perfect interviews. No matter how well-meaning, how sensitive, empathetic, or reflexive I may be, interviews can be unpredictable, complex, and may require immense emotional labor. And I'm aware that up until now I've just been talking about interviews. If I started talking about focus groups, we'd be here all day, but the ethical issues in focus groups are even more intense. And if anybody has questions on focus groups, I'd be happy to talk about those as well. And the same thing occurs, of course, if you're administering a questionnaire, and I've also had experience of doing that. After 20 years, occasionally I do still feel disappointed for various reasons that an interview didn't go as well as I hoped. Reflexivity is hard work. It requires a lot of attention to how participants are reacting, looking at their body language, being sensitive about what's being said, but also about what is not being said. It's paying attention to the silences as well. It requires researchers to really, really pay attention, to be good listeners and good observers. And if somebody were to ask me, what is the key skill that a researcher needs? I would say without doubt, the most important skill of a researcher is to be a good listener. I think listening is a very undervalued skill in society today. Everybody wants to talk, everybody wants to say their piece, but actually being a good listener is an incredibly rare and very valued skill, and you can learn to become a better listener. And if you're doing interviews, you absolutely have to be listening all the time, because those little nuggets can just be mentioned briefly and then you move on and then you think afterwards, oh no, I wish I'd asked more questions about that. I wish I'd listened more when they were talking about such and such an issue. So reflexivity means being honest with oneself, but also being open to self-criticism. We are not aiming for action here, but rather to learn from experiences and to think about how we can do things better next time. I would also say it is really important to take time between interview encounters, whether it's a questionnaire, a focus group, an interview, an ethnography, whatever it is, you should always factor in time in between to pause and reflect and make notes. You should never rush from one research encounter to another. Sometimes it's tempting because of time. You say, oh yes, I can do 2 or 3 that day. I'm in the area. I can do a few while I'm there. But actually, you really need to take time to reflect in between. And of course, to talk to colleagues or supervisor, and don't be afraid to ask for advice. And remember, we are all constantly learning. So I'm just going to finish with some references. As I said, if anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoint with the references, then you are very welcome, and I will send them along.